regarding the New York mayor Zohran Mamdani. He had earlier promised to arrest Israeli Prime Minister, that is Benjamin Netanyahu, if ever he visited New York. Time and again he has reiterated on the same thing and promised several times that he will be arresting Netanyahu. So what has happened 2 days ago? On 21st July, he clarified that the city has no legal authority to enforce the International Criminal Court arrest warrant. Why? Netanyahu is expected to attend the United Nations General Assembly in September. So why it was in news? What is the context basically? And this raises important issues and important questions regarding the International Criminal Court, international law that is there in the world, the sovereign immunities that some heads of the state and heads of the governments they hold, the federalism, how is it practiced in actual sense in the USA, and the limits of local governments powers. How can you relate it with UPSC? For mains it is important, for GS2 and for prelims you need to remember the pointers regarding International Criminal Court. So with regard to International Criminal Court warrant, what is the background? ICC had issued an arrest warrant back then in November 2024 as well. The charges included war crimes and crimes against humanity on Netanyahu only. Now, what were the allegations basically? Use of starvation as a method of warfare, directing attacks against the civilians that he had conducted, many murders that were involved, persecution of some citizens, then other inhuman acts which are considered inhumane by the international laws that are there. The period basically covered from 8th October 2023 to 20th May 2024. It was also charged that the former Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, he had also committed certain crimes. Thus, the exam keyword here is that ICC warrants rely on member states for the enforcement. They are defunct otherwise. Now, why can't New York arrest Netanyahu? What is the reason now? What is the legal position basically? What is the status? So ICC has no police force of its own. It has to rely on the member countries for the manpower. It depends on the member countries for the execution of warrants at ground level. USA's position in this regard is basically it is not a state party to the ICC. USA has not signed International Criminal Court, so it is not a member of International Criminal Court. Thus, it is not enforceable. Israel is also not a state party to the ICC. What are the consequences here now? So ICC warrant has no automatic legal force within the United States since it is not a member. This results into the New York City has no independent authority to execute the warrant because the country itself is not a member of ICC. So the local administration cannot independently take charge and take any decision regarding this. So ICC, to simplify it further, ICC warrant, then it requires member states enforcement, then USA, since it is not a member of ICC, so no domestic legal obligation is there and New York cannot arrest him. Now what are the powers of the New York mayor? Scope, let's look at the scope of municipal authority, what the mayor can do and what it cannot do. What it can do, he's the head of the city administration, then he supervises the NYPD in New York, then it controls the city agencies that are governing over there, it manages municipal governance as well. What the mayor cannot do, now there are certain limitations to the powers of the mayor, the local government basically. It cannot conduct the foreign policy, it cannot dictate the foreign policy as well, then it cannot implement treaties because it is the job of the federal government, the US government as a whole. It cannot execute international arrest warrants like of Netanyahu, that's why it has surfaced. Then It cannot override the federal authority. It cannot go beyond the central government, beyond the federal government's decision. What are the key constitutional principles here? The foreign affairs are the exclusive domain of the federal government of USA and not a local matter wherein the local administration can override or take decisions beyond the federal government. Now, what is the UPSC value addition here? The local governments cannot independently implement the international legal obligations. So, there are certain immunities that have been given to the heads of the states and heads of the government. This is the principle of customary international law, which means that the sitting heads of the state and government generally enjoy immunity from the criminal jurisdiction in foreign domestic courts while in office. What is the implication here? That even if allegations exist, domestic authorities generally cannot prosecute or arrest the serving heads of the state or government. There is additional protection that is also given to the heads of the states and government, that is, if attending the United Nations General Assembly, protections under the UN headquarters agreement may further restrict the arrest because they are still attending the conferences related to United Nations, that is the UNGA. The key concept here is that the head of the state immunity protects diplomatic functioning between the sovereign states. Now, additional legal constraints are also there. Why the enforcement is difficult? American Services Members Protection Act, which came into force in 2002, it was legalized, it was implemented after the International Criminal Court, and it basically says not to cooperate with the ICC, with the International Criminal Court. So this restricts the cooperation with ICC arrest efforts and UN headquarters agreement. As per this facilitates participation of foreign representatives at the United Nations. Visiting leaders receive certain protections while attending the UN meetings to foster their presence and to prevent them from any such action. So what is the practical outcome here? Even if federal authorities are unlikely to execute an ICC warrant against an official UN visit, then the important phrase that we need to remember here is international obligations, they must align with the domestic legal frameworks as well to make them more robust and to execute them, to help them execute in real sense. They need to align with each other. So let's look at the key concepts here. Local governments, first of all, they cannot independently implement international criminal law. Then ICC, it is International Criminal Justice Institution. War crimes means serious violations during any armed conflict. Then crimes against humanity, widespread or systematic attacks on the civilians is usually referred to as the war against or crime against humanity. Then federalism in the USA, foreign affairs reserved, the matter of the foreign affairs or this particular subject is reserved for the federal government and not comes under the purview of local government. Then head of the state, they enjoy certain immunities, like protects them from any sort of execution, the serving heads of the government. Then United Nations headquarters agreement, as per this ensures participation of member states and their representatives. Now there are certain prelims pointers and mains relevant important things. So firstly, ICC has no independent police force. It has to rely on, like we reiterated, it has to rely on the member countries for its legal manforce. Then USA is not a member of the ICC, and so does Israel. Israel is also not a member of ICC. Foreign affairs are handled by the federal government. This is with respect to USA. and not the city administration. The city administration cannot override or go beyond the decisions of the federal government. Then American Services Member Protection Act restricts cooperation with the ICC arrest. This was implemented in 2002 after ICC came into force. Then with respect to mains, we need to remember certain things. What was the issue first of all? The enforcement challenges faced by international judicial institutions. Time and again this is being discussed. Then what are the various dimensions to this? First of all, there are certain limits on the international criminal law. Then conflict between domestic sovereignty and international obligations. There is a tussle between both of these. Then what is the role of federal governments in implementing international commitments? What is their relation with each other? Then to conclude, basically, the case highlights the practical limitations of the international criminal justice. At ground level, what are the challenges basically that the governments face or that these international agencies face? So when domestic legal system and sovereign authority do not provide enforcement mechanisms, so they are not in coherence with the international agreements basically. Thank you.